Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is October 18th, 2019. Tonight, Canada's first post-truth election with Stephen Lautens. Remember that excruciatingly long 2015 federal campaign in Canada? With the one party that had that leader nobody respected outside of his ever-shrinking cult? The same party that insisted the other guy just couldn't handle the big chair? Well, it didn't turn out so well for that party, to most of Canada's relief. So this time around, that party will have learned from that lesson, right? Right? Apparently not. The way they see it, they didn't go far enough to ensure their narrative controlled the scenario at all times, from all angles and all directions, delivered by as close to all outlets as possible. Hell, even make up some outlets to push the propaganda. More is more. How can we lose? It worked for Brexit, it worked for Trump, it worked for Ford, it worked for Kenney. Bring on the post-truth ascension of the Ordered Populists, eh? From Season 1, Episode 17, to tonight's Season 12, Episode 6, The View Up Here has welcomed Stephen Lautens to bring humor, irony, satire, insight, and bold reality to Canada's political tribulations. We look at some of the sustained efforts that have made their way to Canada from, mostly, the Republican Party of the U.S., be it directly or by enhanced proxy. It's no longer about facts, policies, economics, or a national vision. It's all about setting the narrative on every subject back to one purported cause. The absolute unsuitability of one man who represents a version of Canada the whole world recognizes and overwhelmingly holds in good standing. The Canadian electorate knows more about the party and its leader, who have been government over the last 4 years, than any other option on the ballot. Yet the non-stop narrative of what they are about leaves a dangerous void. The View Up Here is once again very honored and pleased to welcome back for his, get this, 8th appearance on the show, Mr. Stephen Lautens. Hello, Stephen. Welcome back.
Hi, Glenn. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me back on for an 8th time. I can't believe that, like they say, when you're having a good time, the time just flies by.
Well, considering that we are coming up to another federal election, the final show before the vote, I could think of no better guest than you yourself.
We're going to sway all those votes at this point, I'm sure. Lots of people still on the fence.
Who's going to report us to Elections Canada?
Exactly. Oh, I'm sure someone will.
Well, Canada's first post-truth election, I believe that is an accurate term, unfortunately. I mean, for listeners, Stephen come up with the title for this, and I'm just curious, is it more of a tongue-in-cheek thing, or are you more serious than usual by picking that name?
Well, probably a little from column A and a little from column B. And this has been a remarkable election, and without giving away just sort of how old I actually am. I worked in the first Trudeau government, the Pierre Trudeau government, as a special assistant on the political side. So I've seen a lot of elections. I've worked a lot of elections. I haven't worked one recently. It's for the younger people to go out and knock on doors and pound signs. But I've seen a lot of elections, provincial and federal. And I think this is the dirtiest, most lying election I have ever seen. I mean, there's all kinds of political lies. I mean, political lies are stock and trade. People stretch the truth, or they fudge their past, or they say they attribute things to their opposition that isn't quite true. But this is the first election I have seen where the actual lies have come so fast and furious and shamelessly. And it really is a post-truth, a post-factual election, because it doesn't seem to matter anymore, especially on the conservative side of things. They really seem to have taken lying as a campaign strategy. It's not just one of the casualties of war. It is the way they intend to get elected. And they have geared an entire election campaign to untruths. And it's absolutely remarkable. I mean, I don't know where we go from here. I mean, we've seen it in the United States. I mean, we see Trump who wouldn't know the truth if he met it backstage at a beauty contest. He's made lying and dumb lying an art form, and he just doesn't care anymore. And unfortunately, a lot of that is leaked into Canadian politics in this federal election. And there's lots of ways that you can think it came this way. I mean, some of it is we just live next door to the United States. We watch CNN or, God help you, even Fox News. You see what's going on down there. So, it doesn't make it okay, but it's really hard it's like sitting in a room with someone who swears a lot. And eventually, even though you don't swear, every once in a while you're going to drop an F-bomb or two just because you're in a room with someone who swears all the time. And the United States has been like that for the last 3 years for Canada. But in terms of people not telling the truth, especially, Trump and his revolving door of circus clowns and sycophants, they cannot tell the truth. And they will not tell the truth because the truth doesn't help them most of the time. But being next to them all the time, I think Canadians have built up a tolerance for lying that we never had before. We used to call people out for, campaign gimmicks and being caught with an untruth or being caught with something in your resume that was not correct. That would be like instant resignation as a candidate or as a cabinet minister or as a leader or something if you were caught doing that, because the public wouldn't put up with it. And the public really now has a tolerance for lies, maybe a carelessness towards lies that allows political parties to get away with it. And, not unusually, the first party to adopt the worst aspects of American politics is the Conservatives. I mean, they go to the same campaign schools, they have interchanges, they borrow staff back and forth, they work each other's elections to see how it's done. I mean, politics in the United States is a big business. And the Conservative Party goes down to the States and learns at Republican boot camp for political activism. I'll say that the Liberals go down and do Democrat stuff too. They work together to see how they operate. They learn polling. They learn, pulling the vote techniques, all that kind of stuff. But the Conservatives seem to be different because they go down there to learn how to lie. And they come back and they apply it to Canadian politics. And there isn't the pushback that I would hope to have seen from Canadian voters in this election. We seem to be shrugging it a bit and going like, okay. So so that's a long way of saying, it's kind of a jokey concept, but it's really quite serious because I'm not sure how we get back to where we were.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I also subscribe that not all that long ago, if someone started laying out the whoppers on the campaign trail, it would be a much different reaction than we're seeing these days. But as far as the issue of Canadian politicians not being afraid, publicly and privately, to cooperate with parties south of the border, not only do the Conservatives go across the border for strategy meetings, etc., in Alberta, there is a member of the Legislative Assembly named Devin Dreeshen, who was elected under Kenney's party, who worked for the Trump campaign. There were pictures of him wearing his red MAGA hat on social media before the Alberta election. So, I mean, this is just a common practice. And then, of course, another topic I'm sure that will come up in this little show we're doing here, the International Democratic Union, who I have covered, in the last couple months through different avenues. And if you look at the IDU's website, it says right on it that their purpose is to share campaign methods, fundraising, polling. They share everything. If they find a gimmick that works in Hungary, they're going to try it in Canada. If they find one that works in the US, they're going to try it in the United Kingdom. This has become a one-size-fits-all make-up bullshit way to do politics. And I guess, we just can't escape it. I mean, we're not that immune. We like to pretend we are. And actually, I think Canada has done a pretty good job of withstanding the standard disruption techniques that we've seen in liberal democracies over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think it's causing consternation among those who wish to disrupt. Why won't these people just fall into line already? But they're not giving up, obviously. I mean, no matter what counter claims and proof come out, I think the difference between 2019 and, say, even 2015, oh, you found our lie. Well, so what? Here's another one.
Yeah, and it's that endless stream. I mean, if you follow the Conservatives at all on social media, and it's hard not to see them because they buy ads and they push it out to you, and their spend on Facebook and Twitter is enormous. It dwarfs everybody else's spend on it. They came out early on with the 100 fails memes. I think it's like hashtag 100 fails, and it's a little cookie cutter thing that they do, and they pick something that they don't like about Trudeau, and or some failure, and push it out every day. And it's the idea of like every day we're going to tell you something that Trudeau did terrible. And the problem is there are only a handful of them that you could look at fairly, like completely without partisan lenses or anything. You look at it and go like, okay, yeah, that's true, that's fair. There's only, of the 100 that I've seen, maybe 2 or 3 that you go like, okay, yeah, that's a valid criticism. The rest of them are torqued so much that you don't that the truth is completely missing from it. I mean, they use short little clips from Trudeau quotes that are completely contrary to what he was saying. I mean, there's one where he talked about one of the 100 fails that the Conservatives put out was part of the Trudeau loves terrorists leitmotif that they have been hammering on for ages. Is that Trudeau said that returning ISIS fighters have a valuable contribution to make. And you're like, oh, isn't he crazy saying that they have a valuable contribution? I say, well, if you look up the quote, and I'm a footnote guy, I'm a source guy. I like to see. I look at something and I go like, that doesn't sound right to me. I want to look it up. I want to find the source. I want to find exactly where it came from. So you look up these quotes. And if you do this with any one of the CPC's, 100 days of failure of Trudeau, you see that they've taken this little clip from the middle of it. So in the case of the returning ISIS fighters, Trudeau said, and I think I tweeted about this, he said, they have a valuable contribution to make because these people come back disillusioned with what they saw, and they are changed people, and they can go back into their own communities and tell other people who are thinking about becoming radicalized that this is a dead end for them and discourage future terrorists from going over in the first place, which is a completely different message than the 100 fail, which is Trudeau loves terrorists because he thinks that returning ISIS fighters are wonderful people. It's like, that's not what he was saying at all. But of course, it's red meat for the thing. And it's you use the words, but it's a lie. It's sort of like in 2000, before 2015, they were going on about that old, that Trudeau loves China's basic dictatorship. Say, well, if you looked at the whole quote about that, number one, he was joking because he was saying, boy, it would sure be easy to do, get through our climate change stuff because, in China, because you got to admire their dictatorship. They get stuff done. And it's like, yeah, but they're terrible people. And there's no way we'd do that, which was the context of that quote. But they take that little tiny quote and they torque it and they put it out and they slap it on a whole bunch of bumper stickers, and that it's a lie by not giving the full story. The lies come so fast and furious. It's really hard to catalog them. One of the big lies that was brought out, I think, just about last week, and oddly enough, it was brought out in Chinese language on the Conservatives' Facebook page. It wasn't brought out in any other language, was that, Trudeau's already legalized marijuana. Now he's going to legalize hard drugs. In the Chinese community, they were, for whatever reason, they were very, very concerned about hard drugs. And they were pushing this micro-targeted ad out with this lie because the Liberals have no intention of legalizing hard drugs. It came from a statement I think Trudeau made in it was either in an interview or in the debate where someone says, well, what about hard drugs? You legalize marijuana. Are we going to go to hard drugs? And Trudeau said, we're not even thinking about that yet. But the word yet is what they all jumped on. Is like, oh, you said yet. You mean you're going to do it sometime? So the Conservatives have torqued that into the secret agenda. The Liberals are going to decriminalize all the hard drugs, and you're going to have meth heads living next to you and all the rest. That's one of the lies that they sent out. The Stop Foreign Aid to Rich Countries meme that they put out, saying that we send hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid to high-income countries. Absolutely not true. High-income countries don't qualify for aid. It's literally not possible to send aid to high-income countries. The largest sums that Canada sends in foreign aid is actually these days to Iraq and Lebanon, which have in some senses healthier economies than an awful lot of developing countries, but they're sending it for refugee support because there's humanitarian crisis there. But, it's this idea that Scheer is going to save all this money that he's now going to give to veterans or homeless or people he never intends to give it to in the first place. But he's going to have all this money left over by stopping foreign aid because Conservatives hate giving money to foreigners just generally. There's, they faked a Time magazine cover. There's a legitimate Time magazine cover that had Trudeau standing there and had a caption, and that wasn't good enough for them. They had to actually change the caption without making it obvious that they changed the caption and pushed it out as if it was the real Time magazine cover. So, another lie. They came out with a fake statistic. Bob Soroya sent out a flyer to an election flyer saying that 50% of illegal border crossers, we can talk about illegal in a second, but 50% of illegal border crossers have criminal records. The actual statistic from immigration is 0.4%. It's not 50%, it's less than 0.5%. And and the problem now is when you confront them with a lie. So someone confronted the candidate, Bob Soroya, and said, that's not true. Look, it's 0.5%. It's not 50%. And he says, well, one is too many. But You're lying. It doesn't matter if one's too many or half of one is too many. You lied, and you're caught in a lie, and you just bold-face it out. You're just you're not gonna say like, oh gosh, I don't know where that number came from. I guess we got a decimal place in the wrong place. It's like, nah, screw you. 50%, it's out there. It's done its damage.
Well, in the conservative mindset, what's the difference between 50% and half of 1%?
Well, we know they're not good with numbers, so.
Well, just to go back to the thing about the Chinese only ad, what you're speaking of is perfect because it didn't take long for the Vancouver Sun. The Lower Mainland, we have a large Chinese community, and this was basically where it was targeted. The Vancouver Sun was on it, and they went to the Conservative Party and asked them for comment, and we get a response from Conservative spokesman Simon Jeffries that they kind of discounted the premise they were selling, when in fact, with further investigation, they pulled this out of context from something in 2018 when Justin Trudeau was talking about what Portugal has been doing. And there is a common misconception that Portugal has legalized all drugs, but they have not. They have simply decriminalized all drugs. And what happens in Portugal is if you get caught with hard drugs, you are sent to a special court and you are sent to treatment or whatever programs they have that could get you off the road to hard drug usage. And that's still through a court. You're just not going to get a criminal record. They're actually trying to get people on the correct path instead of law and order, throw them in jail. Now, the response from Simon Jeffries is, if Justin Trudeau tells us precisely when he is going to legalize dangerous drugs, we will amend our ads to reflect the new information.
Right. When did you stop beating your wife? And then we will issue a retraction.
This is unbelievable. It's like, okay, yeah, we lied, but if you give us a new premise to lie again, we will adjust our lie.
Yes.
And they seem to have absolutely no qualms with doing this. And that part of the world, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, they have death penalties for trafficking drugs. And I think playing on the fears of expats from this part of the world is very cheap, beyond the obvious dishonesty of it, but the manipulative degree to which they have no qualms whatsoever in going to just to try and get people to come into their camp, whether it's legitimate or not. I agree. This is a new low. And, the other thing, this foreign aid to rich countries, when I first heard that, the first thing that came to my mind was this is a tagline to set it up that if Scheer was to become prime minister, any country that is not a member of the International Democratic Union would no longer be getting foreign aid from Canada because, we only give money to people on our team. That's the first thing I thought when I read that, and I found that a few times. I think some of these lies and positions that Scheer puts out, if people look at it in the context of Emperor Harper's little gem of an organization, the IDU, there are definite signs there that whatever the mothership says, that's what's going to happen here. But the media has absolutely no desire to make these connections, which is another issue altogether.
Yeah, well, and we'll talk about sort of dark money in a little bit, but just again, they micro-target. You're talking about the Chinese community in Lower Mainland. The Conservatives target groups that they think that they can bamboozle. Either because they're not consumers of mainstream media particularly, or they have particular interests that affect mostly that community or that socioeconomic group. The fake property tax is a great example. This is just a whopper of a lie. And it is still out there, because the seniors are perhaps more easily scared, a little more precarious than a lot of people, and get their news from different places. And so they came up with months, about a month and a half ago, that the Liberals have got a secret plan to put a 50% capital gain tax on your home. Homes right now, your principal residence is exempt from capital gains tax. So this would be a big cash grab. But the problem is it's absolutely untrue. I mean, the genesis of it, again, if you look it up, is a town hall meeting where they invite members of the community and or grassroots notional Liberal Party members to come in and kick around ideas about what do you think would help the lack of inventory in housing, and someone puts up their hand and says, geez, if there's a 50% capital gains tax on your home, I bet you that would slow down house flippers, and and someone writes it down on the big whiteboard and they present it to a big sheet of paper. I used to go to these sorts of policy conferences and you get all kinds of interesting ideas at some of them, and it gets passed up the line, and and basically no one does anything with it. But somebody found it in the minutes of this town hall meeting, and I think it was Adam Vaughan's riding in Spadina, and the Conservatives clipped a little piece of that thing saying, look, it's a secret Liberal document that is going to put a 50% capital gains tax on your home, and they're just waiting until after the election to do this to you, and all you older people who got all your money stuck in your house, or young people who are trying to get ahead, you're going to lose half of the value of your house every time you move up. And it's like, that's not what it said. And even when they were called out on it, I mean, Adam Vaughan immediately called them out on it. Again, it was just like, yeah, we don't care. We don't care what you said. It's your document. We don't care what you say.
Yeah.
No context. We're just going to soldier through with our lie. And then they actually came out, and it wasn't good enough just to lie about it and have a clip out of a actual document. They actually doctored up the document, and they put it out. And the Toronto Star finally contacted and said, this isn't the document. We've seen the document. The picture you have is not the document. You've changed it, to put the Liberal logo much bigger and all the rest. And the Conservatives finally replaced it, but they replaced it with an older lie, an older version of the memo that was first published by Pierre Poilievre in September. So, you catch them in a lie, it's like whack-a-mole. They come up with a better lie or a different lie or a variation on the lie. And it's like, oh my God, I'm so exhausted just trying to correct these things. And that's sort of part of the strategy, which is come out with lots of lies. It's like fact-checking Trump. It's like poor Daniel Dale I met Daniel Dale not too long ago at the National Newspaper Awards. He won for that category while he was still working in Canada. for fact checking Trump. And you just say, it's exhausting because the lies are so fast and furious that people can lie faster than you can fact check and correct. And by the time you've corrected the first lie, they're on to their 47th lie, and everyone's forgotten the first lie. So they just keep ahead of it. So, and this is, the fake property tax, it's still floating around out there as if it is true. And the Conservatives will leave it out there as long as it is working for them and scaring some little old lady in Leaside or in Westmount or somewhere who's afraid that, the Liberals are going to steal half the value of their house. And then you got like just the crazy stuff. I mean, every election has its crazy people, but one of Scheer's federal candidates in southwestern Ontario, in London Fanshawe, the Conservative candidate, Michael Van Holst, he's an anti-fluoridation guy. And, fluoridation is the cause of all kinds of social ills and all the rest. And he actually publicly compared the water treatment process to women being drugged and sexually assaulted by Bill Cosby because, we're putting stuff in their water without them knowing about it. And I'm like, that's really maybe not a great analogy. You've got that kind of crazy stuff going on out there. It's really hard to, even, the more pedestrian lies are like, okay, but people say these things now and you're not laughed out of town. It's just like, okay, well, move on.
Well, the thing that really demonstrates to me how there is no regard. I mean, if you want to start digging up transcripts from either EDA meetings or town hall meetings where people can basically say whatever whack idea they come up with. Just imagine if the transcripts from some of the conservative electoral district association meetings came out and was given the same application. Because
I love, you can go online because every federal and provincial party has a policy conference every year or two. Mm-hmm. And that's when the nuts really get to come out and all the little riding associations, people come out with these resolutions, some of which pass, some of which don't pass. But if you actually can find online there's a liberal one, there's a conservative one, and you pull up the conservative one, you see what some riding association in Alberta has suggested, about turning people into Soylent Green. And it's hilarious going through it, but it's also scary because then you kind of go through and go, well, that one almost passed, or that one did pass. Not that policy conferences are binding on a government or even on a party, because that would be inconvenient for leadership. But as an expression of sort of what the party is thinking is acceptable talk, it's really something to see. And anyone who wants to Google, the Conservative Policy Conference document to see the raw resolutions, like you said, there's some really out there stuff in them.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, when you look at the context of this 50% capital gains tax on principal residence sales, the specific reason it was brought up was as a tool to calm down the hyperinflated markets and the prevalence of home flipping. That was how it was brought up and suggested. It didn't make it past that meeting. It didn't get passed on by the EDA, nothing. It's just like, yeah, thanks, no thanks.
Yeah.
But then, as you said, if you look at the stuff that's brought up in the conservative at the quote unquote grassroots level, a lot of this whack job ideas.
Oh, way scarier stuff. Scarier stuff.
And they get all the way to the floor at the national convention.
Yeah.
So
and close votes sometimes on some of them too.
Exactly.
Especially if you're talking around women's reproductive rights and guns and immigration and all of the things that conservatives love to love and love to hate.
And sexual orientation.
Anyway, so that was the genesis of that one, but that one still has legs and it's still walking around. And the other thing too, I mean, these are the overt lies. I mean, these are the ones that the boys in short pants at the Scheer campaign headquarters think are funny or clever. There's also sort of the whisper campaigns that we've seen. There's been a couple of actors in this election who love to say, oh, there's stories coming about Trudeau, and there's a couple of journalists. I'm making the biggest air quotes I possibly can. Journalists who repeat, and typically you see it in the Sun Change campaign, or some of the right wing or right wing bloggers, and they'll say, oh, these rumors about Trudeau and a student. Depending on how you hear the story, it's like, Trudeau is a teacher. Oh, yeah, affair with a student. No, it was an affair with a soccer mom. No, it was an affair with another teacher. It's like they can't even get really the whisper campaign right, but it's something in that region that's all salacious. What they do is they kind of get it out there. They release it in the wild, and they try to see who's going to chase that rabbit. They'll say, like, is there a mainstream journalist who's going to pick it up? Is it going to get out on Twitter? Is it in Facebook? Is it going to get big enough that someone starts looking into it and just repeats the rumor? That's all we want, someone to repeat the rumor, even to deny the rumor. Because as soon as you get out there and deny the rumor, then it's out there and people are talking about going, why would he have to deny a rumor like that? Maybe they didn't look closely enough. And of course, these stories have been around for ages. I remember looking up, there was a 2017 article in Frank magazine. Sometimes you love Frank, sometimes you hate Frank, but it has all kinds of scurrilous stuff in there. And it had an article about Warren Kinsella shopping this story around back in 2017. No one was buying back then, but it's been shopped around and shopped around and shopped around. And finally, the Toronto Star and I think the Globe and Mail both went and looked at it. They actually put reporters on it. They called up people. They did what journalists are supposed to do. It's like, all right, it's a story, I guess. We better, it's out there. We bam. They come back and go, there's nothing here. Like we've talked to the teachers, the students, the principals, the people who knew them, all the rest, like we did all the real gumshoe journalism stuff that you're supposed to do to verify sources. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing here. But the whisper campaign continued. They would say, oh, there was going to be this big story in the Globe and Mail, but then the Liberals got an injunction. An injunction, it's a court document. You go look it up at the courthouse. There's no injunction. I'm trying to remember which journalist it was who wrote about it. But one of the mainstream journalists or parliamentary reporters said, look, there's no injunction. We would have known there's an injunction. No one is killing the story. It's not this secret that is out there, and it's sort of an inside Ottawa thing that no one will touch. It's not a story because it didn't happen, because there's absolutely no evidence of it happening. But they keep these sort of whispery stuff going on, and the whole idea is just to poison the atmosphere. And in a world where lies are the stock in trade, it's like, well, maybe it could be true. And that's all you got to do. And the Conservatives just, on Facebook, on Twitter, wherever you hang out, they were just going at it. And it's a story that's been debunked completely. But I'm sure there's tons of people to this day who still is like, oh, I don't know, there must be something to it. But there was actually an article in the Sun, because of course, the Sun would pick up a story like this. The Toronto Sun, and say, well, there's a lot of smoke. And they literally said, there's a lot of smoke. So, there's got to be some fire here somewhere. It's like, no, they checked. There's no fire. The only smoke is the smoke you guys are blowing. So that's sort of where we ended up with sort of post-factual campaigning.
Well, I find this rather ironic, I guess, is the friendliest way to put it. The Sun chain saying that there's a lot of smoke. This is like an arsonist saying, I think that thing over there might catch on fire sometime, you better be careful. And I mean, this is the biggest difference that I've seen. And I also covered this in the global disruption machine from last week. We looked at three vectors. We looked at big data and social media. We looked at mass media, and we looked at political party collusion. And these are three things that Canada has never seen to this degree before.
Yeah.
And especially with mass media. I mean, just off the top of my head, the entire Toronto Sun staff, Warren Kinsella, Robert Fife, Don Martin, John Iveson, Paul Wells, Andrew Coyne, anybody named K in media, Robin Urbach, Jackie Delaney. I mean, there's just no end to it. Now, what I can't figure out is that because that's where the revenue is? Because this is the tactic that is getting clicks and ad views? Or is there something deeper? Or are they actually on the team that wants to see this change?
Well, I mean, I mean, we've all seen sort of the famous matrix of who supports who. I mean, there's the problem with going back to the newspaper business, or the newspaper or the media business, which now is newspapers and radio and online and TV. I mean, there's certain organizations that are directed, and we saw this in the last election. They have their endorsements written from head office, and everyone's going to print the same endorsement of the same party, generally conservative. I mean, there's only a handful of news outlets that endorsed the Liberals in any of the last 3 or 4 elections. The rest of them don't have a lot of editorial freedom because it is being dictated by a handful of families that own the media, and they set the endorsements at a high level. And while I'm sure some of the senior journalists feel like they have independence and integrity and all that kind of thing. And I come from a newspaper family. My family has been in the newspaper business without a break for 99 years this year.
Wow.
In one way or another, starting with the Winnipeg Free Press, going back to 1918. I guess that's 1918. It was the first time someone had a job at a newspaper. And there's been someone, we've been in the Toronto Star, the Winnipeg Free Press. I've written for the Sun Chain. I wrote for the Sun Chain for 16 years. I wrote for the National Post for about a year. My father was with the Hamilton Spectator, and then the Toronto Star. He was managing editor of the Star. He was there for ages. I had one cousin was one of the co-founders of Cosmopolitan magazine with Helen Gurley Brown. One worked for Time Canada, People magazine. My uncle Trevor, who is the right winger of the family, just retired from writing, and he was an editor of the Vancouver Sun and a writer there for 40 years or something. So there's a lot of ink in my blood, and so I like to think of the best of journalists. I mean, a lot of journalists. I'm also a governor of the National Newspaper Awards, which rewards excellence in journalism in Canada every year. I believe there's a lot of integrity in journalism. I believe there are a lot of journalists who try to be fair and factual and get the story. But it's really hard in this environment to go against your corporate masters because even if no one's telling you what to write, what they like. And it's a competitive business these days. It's a shrinking business. Fewer and fewer people have regular jobs, more freelance stuff, so they can pick and choose what stories and people they like to pay. So they go like, no, I'm going to pass on that story, but this one that says sheer hugs puppies. I'm going to pay for that one, and that will be our guest column. So there's a lot of competition that's under the surface, even with some of the big names. I don't think that people are necessarily in the bag for a party, but there are all these, I think some people certainly are in the bag for certain parties. But, I think by and large, when I see certain journalists being accused of, shilling for a party, it's like, well, maybe it's an unconscious thing, or, as long as they're beating up everyone pretty fairly all around, then I'm prepared to give someone a pass. Just because someone writes something bad about someone I like doesn't mean to me that they're in the bag for the other person, as long as every once in a while they beat up on someone I don't like. But there's also the game of journalism has changed so much. It's now a competition for eyeballs and for clicks. The monetizing of articles, the requirement now that journalists not just write a story, but they become their own podcasters, the videographers, that they're tweeting, that they're Instagramming. And this comes right from the top, where the editorial board says you got to make yourself a valuable property in order for us to keep you in our stable as a regular columnist. So you got to get out there and do it. So you're competing for eyeballs, you're competing for clicks. So what do? You lean on a bad headline. You write these in. Actually, a lot of journalists do not write their own headlines. So sometimes when I see, a Globe and Mail headline, sometimes I think, I don't know. I've met Robert Fife once, and I don't know anything about him. Actually, he was, I think he got a National Newspaper Award this year as well, and I was at that ceremony. And I don't know if at his level he writes his own headlines, but generally journalists don't write their own headlines. You'll get these little anonymous people who write the headlines, and it becomes clickbait because they want you to click on it. So the headline may have nothing to do with the conclusion of the article itself, but in this instant click, pass around really fast, forward without actually reading the article, the headline becomes the story. And I know there's been a couple of articles that were actually a lot more fair, written by Robert Fife and other people, than the headlines would suggest. And I don't ascribe that necessarily to the journalists themselves, because they didn't write the headline. It was written by some gnome down in the social media department. So it's hard for me to say that some journalists, I tear my hair out a little bit because I think they're being unfair, or they're skewing a story wrongly. Especially if you know anything about the subject, invariably you find that journalists have cut corners, or they've got a spin on it, or there's a leading thing. The CBC has been terrible this election. CTV has been pretty aggressively anti-Trudeau this election as well. And I don't say that just because I support the Liberals, even though the Liberals don't necessarily support me. I support them, but I see things being skewed in terms of just the questions that are asked, the things that they feature, even a look sometimes changes the nature of whether it's an interview or a comment at a debate, or even just the coverage of the stories right now. There's a lot of disappointment in the general state of journalism right now, because, I don't think it is fair and even-handed. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Knowlton Nash, who was a friend of the family, and some of the great broadcasters of news journalism, who never took sides. You could never tell what they thought about a story as they were giving it to you. So there's a level of trust there. Sometimes they got it wrong, but that wasn't necessarily their fault. But we've lost that, because everyone now has to have a brand and a personality. I mean, if you're Rosemary Barton, you've got to have a brand. If you're Robert Fife, you got to have a brand, and you're out there promoting it. That puts you in the story, and anytime you put you in the story, you're not doing journalism anymore. You're now doing comment, and comment is perfectly fine. But it used to be, stuck on one page of a newspaper. It was on the editorial page or on the comment page that faced it, and it was clearly marked as comment. But now, comment is page to page in it. If you have something like the Sun Chain, the Toronto Sun, the entire thing is comment and stereo ads. I guess they don't have stereo ads anymore. It's every news article is put in there in the selection of news, the selection of headlines, for a purpose, and it's put there to advance an agenda. And the National Post has got exactly the same thing. I mean, the National Post, we saw last week, sold out its entire front page. I mean, it was a wrapper. It wasn't a front page, but it sure looked like a front page, because it was branded National Post, and it was a paid-for ad, like we saw in the 2015 election, saying, basically Trudeau's a bum, and you should never vote for him. But it looked like it was a National Post brand, and that cheapens your brand. I mean, it sells, but it cheapens your brand, and it cheapens your journalistic integrity, and it cheapens your impartiality, such as it is. And we've gone that way now, because the editorials are in every article, the way that they're written, the slant that they have, the headlines that they have, and the way that they're promoted. And it seems to be pushing an agenda. And at the moment, that agenda is not a Trudeau agenda. Not that they have to support Trudeau one way or the other. They just have to, I think they still have a duty to be fair.
Well, I think I do agree. I think the biggest factor in that is probably just the evolution of the way things are sold. And I agree with what you said, that it doesn't matter what the publication is. It doesn't matter what the outlet is. The brands of the people delivering the content has so much more influence than it ever did before. It used to be, look at this event, look at this situation. Oh, and it was written by this person. And over a course of time, people would remember that, oh yeah, it's this person. Yeah, they've done a lot of good stuff like this. But now it's about Robert Fife has a new story. And then they tell you what they want you to think about the story. It's not based on the work they've done. It's based on their marquee value. And that's the thing that I find frustrating. The other thing that really drives me nuts, and this is really something that's really picked up since the spring in Canada, you'll see an incendiary headline, and it'll be tweeted out by the author of the story. And the link is behind a paywall.
Oh, and my absolute favorite. Yes. Yep. Well,
and then
mail is the one, they come out with all these stories, whether it's SNC-Lavalin or the blackface stuff, or all these important stories, or at least the stories they want you to think are important, and then you can't read them.
But the thing is, say Fife puts out a story and it's behind the paywall, and then we'll see Iveson say, oh, this is a great piece, great work. Andrew Coyne, outstanding article by Robert Fife. Nobody can read it, but the circle jerk of sycophants says what outstanding work it is. So the vast majority of the people who are going to see this will see the incendiary headline and all these contemporaries say it's great work. And that's the entire message that comes out of it, regardless of what's in it, whether it's birdcage liner or it's factual, or that just loses relevance.
And I'm a big believer in, they're obviously trying to monetize it. I mean, the newspaper business is struggling, and they're trying to find a new pay model and all the rest. So paywalls, I understand paywalls, and I have some subscriptions to some things where I pay to see extra content. And, so I understand why they're doing it. And especially an election is a hot period where people are anxious to read things. And if you got a hot scoop, it's going to be like, well, you can read it, but you got to pay for it. I understand at an economic level why it's important. What I disagree with is sort of, if you've got a story what you think is of national importance, treat it that way and let the nation see it and let the nation evaluate it as well. It's more the discretion which ones you're going to paywall and which ones you're not, because I understand the paywall model and I appreciate it. Like I say, I pay for it. But, there are times when you go like, maybe you shouldn't have paywalled this thing. And at the same time, like you said, there's this self-feeding shark pool right now of journalists who kind of they chorus in support of each other. And I say the legitimacy comes from all, the amplification, because Twitter is all about amplification, and Facebook as well. It's about, how you can get it out and who you can get it out to. And that's why you also have now all of these illegitimate, purely propagandistic, purely lying vehicles that masquerade as news outlets, things like the Post Millennial or the True North News. I mean, these are organization or the Buffalo Chronicle is one of the other ones. They produce nothing but lies. They will sprinkle in. They'll buy a couple of they'll reprint a couple of bits of real news, non-political man bitten by dog kind of stories, just to show that oh look, we do produce real news and we're trustworthy. But then they mix it in with the worst the worst dregs of the internet, trying to either amplify or start these sorts of stories. And the people behind them are just, well, they're unabashed and well known on the conservative side. Some of the people, and they have histories of being sort of in either publishing pro-Kremlin content at some point. Groups like Freebird Media, a blog that promotes Richard Spencer, one of the writers, prominent people at Post Millennial. That's sort of his background. They've also the fiance of Lindsay Shepherd. But they get like 28,000 likes on Facebook for something. Its stories are some of the most widely shared ones online, according to the Digital Democracy Project. But they produce scurrilous lies and amplify the stuff we've been talking about. And that's what they do. And then they get passed around as if they are a real news outlet, and the same, the True North News, they actually just hired Lindsay Shepherd. I think it was this week or last week as an investigative journalism fellow. And, and True North is Andrew Lautens. He writes for them or whatever he does for them. And if you remember Andrew Layton, he made headlines last year for, he ran as a Doug Ford progressive conservative in Ontario, in the London area, and came to light all kinds of his past tweets and Facebook posts, I think charitably described as misogynistic, racist, and homophobic. Terrible stuff. And he finally said, oh, no, I had a mental illness. And, that's why I wrote all this terrible stuff. But I'm not that kind of a terrible person now. But most recently, he was in the news for dogging the Trudeau campaign bus. And he and Rebel News, because we haven't even mentioned Rebel News yet, the granddaddy of all Canadian disinformation outlets, they went to federal court and got a temporary injunction. The case itself has never been heard on the merits. But they were granted an injunction by the federal court to allow them to participate in media scrums. And we saw that at the last couple of debates where they showed up. And, much to their credit, Singh refused to answer any of their questions and just said, where are you from? Nope, not answering your question, because you guys are terrible. So post-millennial stories are aggregated from other media outlets. I say it has some original reporting. You mentioned the Kays. Barbara Kay sometimes they run her opinion pieces. They say, the Buffalo Chronicle I just mentioned, it's showing up more and more in people's news feeds as like, here, the Buffalo, I had about 4 of them today just looking at Twitter. Someone saying, well, the Buffalo Chronicle says that Jody Wilson-Raybould is quietly being touted as the replacement for Trudeau when he steps down after this election. And it's like, that's not a story. That's not happening. But, they put out these inflammatory pieces just to sow dissension and then they get passed around. The problem is how slow, like I said before, or how unwilling third parties are to respond to these things. The Buffalo Chronicle story will be seen up to like 1 million accounts on Facebook before there's any pushback, and then it's on to the next lie again.
Well, this is the thing that really gets me. You mentioned the aggregators. When Huffington Post came along, this was a completely new concept, and they ran with it and became an actual force in the media world. But the way I look at stuff like post-millennial and Buffalo shitpile and other stuff like this strikes me as an RSS feed from Bizarro World. I mean, it used to be that RSS was the way that you could get things sent to you that were of interest to you. And
Yep.
That's been perverted. Now this is just let us in. Just let us in.
Yeah.
And we'll send you all this tinfoil, insane stuff. And if we keep doing it over and over and over, day after day, sooner or later, we believe that you're going to put some stock in what we have to tell you.
Yeah.
And once we can measure that, then we're really going to let it go.
Well, and mainstream media has has put a knife to its own throat in terms of credibility going forward, because you see the Globe and Mail, which is breaking stories on SNC Lavalin and all the rest of the stuff. Then they invite Ezra Levant to be guest opinion journalist, give him their platform, which he's thrilled to have because legitimacy and audience and someone's paying attention. But does anyone think about what it does to the Globe and Mail's brand? I mean, it can't be good unless that's your target audience. I don't think you're going to get a lot of rebel media people going out and getting subscriptions to the Globe and Mail just so they can read Ezra Levant. I mean, it's this mainstream media that sort of is becoming lazily complicit in this fake media citizen journalism that is really just a front for pushing an agenda. I mean, Rosemary Barton on Metro Morning was, when the whole thing about Scheer not being really an insurance broker and having lied about it for years. She said on Metro Morning, I don't know if Scheer was a broker, license, an almost broker, or whether it matters, but I hope there's room in the House of Commons for people with all kinds of experiences. It's like, have you missed the point completely? I mean, I thought you were a smart journalist. It's like, this is about someone lying about their credentials. That used to be like, that's it. I'd resign as leader and I can't do this anymore because, I lied about something that I've been, living this lie about for years. And it appears not just, one little place. It's everywhere. It's in his Who's Who entry. It's in, his House of Commons biography. It's in his materials. But it's like, I hope there's room for people with all kinds of experiences. It's like, no, you're missing the point. He lied about his experiences, and that's important. And has never taken ownership of it. He's had all kinds of weak sauce kind of explanations about, why I did it and why I didn't. And it took journalists, real journalists, time to figure out, how many courses did you take? Did you get licensed? We talked to these people. We talked to those. No, you never got licensed. And I think it was actually Robert Fife who said that, turns out he was just a coffee gopher in an insurance office, putting stickers on license plates. But you get someone of the stature of Rosie Barton saying, it doesn't really matter. I mean, maybe it's good that we have people of all experiences. So they're cutting their own throats by just undermining their own legitimacy as mainstream media. And that allows the Buffalo Chronicle, post-millennial, True North, quote, news to come in and say, hey, we're just as legitimate as those guys because, look, these guys don't care about journalistic integrity either.
Well, this is the thing that before we move on too far, I mean, I just wanted to hop back to the first thing we had on our bullet point list. And,
We have a bullet point list? Oh, I gotta
well,
look. Okay.
well,
Sure.
we do,
Of course we do.
but, you mentioned Rosie Barton kind of giving the pass to what has been more than a decade of misrepresentation of Andrew Scheer. And I just don't understand how it can be so lopsided. I mean, we've heard for years about the trust fund baby, Justin Trudeau, when if you know the facts, you know that he had absolutely no access to that trust fund until he was
45, I think. I'm trying to, don't quote me, but he was in his 40s before he was entitled to the corpus of it, and he got, I think he got a stipend of about $20,000 a year, and that to supplement his income, and that was it. And when it was finally dispersed, it was I think $1.2 million. Which would buy you a starter home in Toronto now. I mean, it's a lot of money. Obviously, it's more money than most people have in a trust fund. But everyone is sure that he is this gazillionaire. When quite frankly, he's when it comes to the political class in Canada, he's fairly modest means. In the meantime, Scheer himself, I have to confess that the day before the election was called, I started the hashtag Scheer's so poor that. And it was in direct response to Scheer putting out another meme that was not strictly accurate about growing up poor. And the Post-Millennial actually used the word poor when it reported on his meme about his humble beginnings. Well, he lived, okay, the proof that he was poor. He lived in a townhouse. It's like, oh my God, how terrible can that be? No word if it's a log townhouse or something like that, like Abraham Lincoln grew up in. His parents didn't have a car. Well, they didn't really say that, it was sort of a choice. They didn't really need a car where they were. It wasn't because they were like ultra poor. And, and his parents, and again, I think it was a Globe and Mail story that ran with it and said, okay, we're going to do some research here. Okay, his mother and father were both union people. They all have contracts. We pulled the contracts. You can see what they were making based on seniority and all the rest. And by the time Scheer was this is in the early 90s. By the time he sort of left the nest, they were making about $100,000 to $120,000 a year, where Canada's median income was $68,000. So it's like they're well above the median, and they're both professionals. One was a nurse, the other one worked actually for the Ottawa Citizen as a proofreader and librarian. His father, who was the American, as it turns out, not an immigrant, he was just American born. Big difference, at least according to conservatives, because they don't like immigrants, but they don't mind people being American born.
Well,
I started this hashtag saying Scheer's so poor that to make fun of the fact that he is lying about his humble origins. And he did it to put himself in contrast with Trudeau, the trust fund baby. Trudeau is so rich that, and I think they came back with after a day or two, they kind of circled the wagon and say, oh, we're going to come back with our own hashtag, Trudeau so rich that. But the Scheer so poor one was to make fun of his lie about his humble origins. And if he had just said, look, I grew up middle class parents. Yeah, sure, we didn't have big fancy vacations or anything like that, but we all did well and we got along, and we didn't do without. I think everyone would have respected that. There's nothing shameful about that. But he had to lie. He had to say that he walks, barefoot in the snow 5 miles to school, uphill and down every day, being chased by wolves. And it's like, why do you lie about stupid stuff like that? Whether it's your insurance broker's license, or where you graduated from university, he wanted to say University of Regina, and he said that over and over again. And it turns out it was University of Ottawa. He took some courses in Regina. He finished it, I think, by correspondence. Not what he said he did, but he had already been an MP for like 4 years when he finally got his BA from University of Ottawa. But he wanted to be able to say, no, look, I'm a Westerner, even though I was born in Ottawa. I lived in Ottawa as a child. I've worked in Ottawa, for the last 20 years almost. But, I'm a Westerner. I'm one of you guys because I graduated from University of Saskatchewan, which is the only reason I can think that he would lie about something that simple. Because, as I sit here doing this podcast, I'm looking up. I can see my university degrees framed on the wall. They're getting a little faded, but I know where I graduated from because it says right on the degree. But he would lie about little things like that. It's a modus operandi. It really, they can't help themselves. And the campaign that they're running this time, they can't help themselves because they don't know the truth and they're afraid of the truth. Because if they told you the truth, no one would ever vote for them.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that just follows the history of this incarnation of the Conservative Party of Canada. Stephen Harper, born in Ontario. Oh, Mr. Calgary, defends Alberta. Does nothing for them in a decade, but he defends Alberta. Jason Kenney, Saskatchewan, Ontario. Now he's here. Oh, he's Pope Kenney in Alberta. The same damn thing. I agree. This is their modus operandi. But just the reality of painting Trudeau as a spoiled rich kid who could not see his inheritance in full until he was in his 40s, which is pretty much the age Scheer is now, but yet at the age of 25, Andrew Scheer was earning $141,000 as a member of Parliament, and he's now making $259,000 as leader of the opposition.
Well, I've seen somewhere that if you put all of his salary together, and I don't think this includes his benefits, because, of course, when he was Speaker, he had a free house, a free driver, free food, free staff at the house as well. So, he was living basically in a mansion with staff, and he didn't have to pay any expenses, and he collected his salary plus his pension. And then as leader of the opposition, he lives in Stornoway, which I think is like a 32-room mansion. Yep. It's not necessarily a lot to look at from the curb, but it's got a lot of space, and he's got a chef, and he's got a driver, and he's got a housekeeper, and he's got a gardener, groundskeeper person. And someone said if you put all of his salary end to end, it came out to about $6 million for his time in public service, and and his pension at the moment is worth a little north of about $3 million. So But, being an American citizen, maybe some of that's been clawed back in taxes. It's hard to tell.
I can understand why they would hesitate to make some things hit the light of day, but don't they realize that this is a snowball effect? The longer you keep this false facade running, the worse it gets, the more impossible it is to get out from behind it and look like you have any dignity whatsoever. Or is it, as you said previous, they just don't care?
Well, it's an odd function of the modern political scene that conservatives, rank-and-file conservatives, will forgive their leaders absolutely anything. I mean, look at Trump as an extreme example. And, the stuff that he does on a regular basis. I mean, he basically breaks the law every single day with something. Whether it's emoluments or it's abuse of executive power or all kinds of things that he's doing, interfering with Congress, and he breaks the law every single day. And his base, which is getting a little smaller, but it's still surprisingly big, they still love him. They forgive everything. In Canada, Scheer not being an insurance broker, I don't think a single conservative I saw said, "Oh wow, that's pretty shabby." Having lied about that, that's, or not knowing where your degree was and being, I don't think a single conservative has ever called out Scheer on any of these lies. I mean, I haven't seen any. Maybe it's just the social media circles that I travel in, but on the other side, on the left, and the NDP and the Liberals, I think the NDP a little bit more than the Liberals, because while I have lots of NDP friends, some of them can be a little sanctimonious. The Liberals, unlike the Conservatives who forgive everything in their leaders, the Liberals and the NDP forgive nothing. The smallest flaw, the smallest whatever. It's like it's so hard to get over because they get disillusioned and they just throw up their hands and go, well, maybe I'll spoil my ballot, maybe I'll vote for a third party. The Conservatives can keep their base together no matter what the lies are, and they know that. I think they know that they can say, like Trump said, I can shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue. He hasn't quite done it yet, but it's still early in the afternoon here, and people will forgive him. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people. But, as soon as Trudeau, and he came in on this wave of relief that he was different, that that he was a good man compared to Harper's, Darth Vader-esque style of government. It's natural to be disillusioned with someone who comes in with such high hopes. There are realists all over the world who go like, yeah, expectations were so high that we're going to be disappointed somewhere. But look at the totality of it. Look at the promises kept. Look at the good work done, whether it's for women or for Indigenous people, or they go like, well, there's still boil water advisories. Like, well, yeah, but they got rid of 86 of them. I mean, that's more than any of the last governments have done. You look at the LGBTQ rights, the recognition, the funding of groups that are disadvantaged. I mean, you look at the totality of the good that someone does, and then you go like, okay, blackface. Yep, that's embarrassing. That's it was 19 years ago. It was stupid. He likes to dress up. Was there racist intent? Only he knows in his heart, but he sure hasn't acted like one for the last decade and a half. Yeah, it's disappointing that the way it came out, when it came out, and that it existed in the first place. But is it a deal breaker? Not if you look at the totality of what he has been able to accomplish. But people get disappointed. The conservatives, and this is one of the purposes, going back to the big theme of this, why do you lie? Why do you put out these misleading memes? Why do you fund these groups like not Ontario Proud, Canada Proud and Strong? The Manning Foundation put almost $250,000 into Facebook ads by donating it to these other third-party groups. So you can't tell where the money came from because it went into the Manning Foundation that then passed it on to these other groups. And they're just amplifying these lies. Why do people do this? And it's to disillusion the people who are expecting more, expecting better, thought that Trudeau or Singh or anyone else or May are all on white chargers and there's a certain level of purity that's required of them. And they know that if they chip away at that through lies and memes and fake news and amplification and troll bots and bot farms, that they can chip away at the confidence that people have, not in the Conservative Party, but in the Liberal or NDP party. In this election, it seems mostly targeted at the Liberals, with the NDP actually being supported a little bit. Mm-hmm. I'm noticing that a lot of right-wing columnists, like in the Toronto Sun, are saying nice things about Singh, and doing little puff pieces on him on social media and all the rest, and going like, well, that's weird. Well, it's not really that weird, because if they can support Singh, it takes support away from Trudeau. That helps them elect a Conservative. So the disillusionment is something that they are trying really, really hard to push through all of these things. And I think the numbers are starting to show that there's a certain weakness there, because a lot of Liberals are kind of giving up on things. I don't think they should, because a lot of it's based on fake news. It's based on gross exaggerations and ignoring the totality of Trudeau's economic record, which is stellar. I mean, the lowest unemployment rates in 40 years. The GDP is up. Our imports and exports are the healthiest they've ever been. New trade agreements. I mean, the economy is doing great right now. But they've sown all this doubt about the personalities, especially Trudeau himself, because he's such a big figure, and they love to hate him too. And they're just trying to get a little wedge in there to let them sneak past the Liberals. And that's the whole purpose of this. I mean, that's why the manipulation of the media, both legitimate and illegitimate, the work on social media. You had a show last week on the Trudeau Must Go hashtag and where that came from, and the manipulation that was behind that. I mean, there was an author. I'm trying to remember his name here. I might even have written it down.
Mark Owen Jones.
There you go, Mark Owen Jones, who did an analysis of Trudeau Must Go for about a month and a half, and found there were about 100,000 tweets in that period, retweets, mentions, replies, by about 12,000 unique accounts, but he traced it back to a handful of sources, all pro-Trump right-wing accounts that were active on the Trudeau Must Go hashtag. And they tweet, a couple of accounts just tweet with superhuman ability, which means, it's an algorithm. It's actually a computer that's doing it. It's not a real human being. There was someone called Sarah, whose hashtag I think is Evening Star. And I'd never heard of her before I read this article. And I actually looked her up, and I'm blocked. And I mean, obviously, there's a list of people who they insulate themselves from. So people who have a bit of a reach, and I've got a bit of a reach on Twitter, so I can't call them out on their bullshit. And so they proactively block people who they think might be a skunk at their picnic. And if I'd known about this, I certainly would have. But, as it came up to me, I thought, well, now I can't even see what she does. But it was basically this one person. She was the nexus that started the entire Trudeau must go. I mean, now it's been picked up by, and the whole idea is, you release it into the wild, you amplify it around until people see it, then real people pick it up. They're not bots, they're trolls, but they're not bots. And, then it's all over the internet. And it's a good way for them to collect data back on the people who are doing it so they can target their next bit of false news or the next hashtag or whatever else. So it is effective in this election. And I think we're really seeing it. Generally, people, except, when we see it in the States, Canadian political machinery has never been willing to go there the way the Conservatives have gone there at this time. I mean, there have been things off limits. I mean, just straight out lying was off limits because the media would call you out. The Canadian public wouldn't stand for it. And now they've fogged up everything, including, mainstream media, and, they're not being called on their stuff. So emboldens them, they get away with it, and they chip away at the people who are likely to vote for, in this case, the Liberal Party. So maybe they stay home. Maybe they spoil their ballot. Maybe they vote for the Greens. Maybe they vote for the NDP. But whatever it is to reduce the biggest threat. So, the Conservatives can cobble together another 37.5% majority.
Well, I think that's absolutely a good explanation for the methods, the strategy enabled. We've seen it before, like we talked about last week on my show. We saw it with Brexit. We saw it with the U.S. presidential campaign. We saw it in the U.S. midterms. We saw it in Ontario with the election. We saw it in Alberta. It's just that I think for, a while, if you stop and think about it, the Conservatives led the way with robocalls, with the official-looking false information, emails and recordings and stuff like that. They just went somewhere where nobody had ever been before. And of course, the fight back, the reaction to it is always delayed. And first card played runs the game. And they're very good at that sort of thing.
Yeah, and they were early adopters of technology. And
yes.
I remember, I worked in the software business for a little while. And one of the projects that we had was to create a delegate tracking program, which hadn't been done before, not in Canada, for a Conservative leadership candidate, provincial. I won't mention who it is, but and it was just it was a job of work that came in, and I sort of looked at the architecture of it. I'm not a programmer or anything, but I knew a little bit about politics and kind of the things that you'd be interested in tracking with someone, so you can track in real time. And this is now 20 years ago. The Americans were even farther ahead of than that. They were doing this kind of stuff when you had big mainframes. But this is sort of the first of the personal computing versions of that sort of sophisticated political software. And the Conservatives in Canada were early adopters of that sort of stuff, and they fed off the United States, who were 10 years ahead of us, and imported a lot of that kind of stuff, and were really, really ahead in being able to do all this kind of stuff, and also imported the idea of automated fundraising, first by generating letters that were tailor-made to the tracked interest of the person you're sending it to. Say, okay, this guy's a gun nut, so we're going to drop into this form letter. It's customizable letters, basically. It's personalized to you, and then it addresses an issue you're specifically interested in the middle of their usual political stuff. So it could be about guns, it could be about abortion, it could be about immigration. But they customize this kind of stuff with an ask in it of $10 or whatever. And they got into perpetual fundraising. That's why the Conservatives still out fundraise the Liberals and the NDP and anyone else. I mean, they do it year round. They do it with micro-targeting, and they do it with such aggression that they raise tons and tons of money by preying on the loyalties and fears of the people who they send it out to. They've always been, whether it's robocalls, again, imported from the States. I mean, the sophistication that it was being done with down there is not your usual kind of recorded message. Hi, I'm the candidate. I hope you vote for me. It would be targeted and followed up on, and they had these massive big data blobs that they now have where they can parse out information about individual Canadians so they know what buttons to push with them and then have the means to go out and reach them. They've now got into social media as one of the first ones to really take that seriously. They got, Trump's campaign was forefront of that. And with the connections that they have back and forth across the U.S. border, as we talked about earlier, that is what they learned. And I talked earlier about dark money. If you haven't read the book Dark Money, it's now getting a little bit old, but it's still very very valid. I mean, something like the Manning Center that I mentioned earlier funded the anti-Trudeau campaigns on Facebook and Instagram through third parties. They gave about $312,000 to related third-party advertising groups. They included Canada Strong and Proud, New Brunswick Proud, Nova Scotia Proud, Newfoundland Strong, Quebec Fier. They all got Manning funding. Then you go like, well, where did Manning get the money from? Well, Manning fundraises itself. One of the interesting things about the Manning Center is they have received in the past, and I have no idea if this money came from it, but in the past they received money from the Atlas Network. Now, the Atlas Network, these are one of these vague, shady named things. You go, hey, who are they? But they're one of the biggest nonprofit American groups that fund and creates conservative think tanks and advocacy organizations throughout the world, which is funded by dark money. It's funded by Charles Koch Charitable Foundation, the Charles Koch Institute, the Earhart Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, the Sarah Scaife Foundation. And so how do we know that American money isn't being funneled through the Manning Center, who reports generally what, that they get money, then they say, here's who we spent it on. But, is that same dollar that came in from the United States, the dollar that went into Newfoundland Strong or Quebec Fier to produce anti-Trudeau memes? There's no way of knowing because there's a gap in the election laws. And they tried, trying to keep the election laws current and responsive to the modern challenges that you get with the sophistication of online marketing and technologies is, you're always playing catch up. There really isn't a way, we say, okay, third party advertisers, they got to register if you spend over, I think it's $500 and report where you get your money from. But if you get your money from the Manning Foundation, well, where'd the Manning Foundation get its money from? Well, it's reported in their general annual general statements. But you can't tell which dollars went where particularly. So they still haven't fixed that problem. And false statements as well. I mean, poor Elections Canada, I feel kind of bad for. They're in this election because everyone was reporting everything. Every time someone tells a lie, they report it to Elections Canada. And, I think I've tweeted it a couple of times. Elections Canada doesn't care about most lies. You can lie your face off in a Canadian election campaign, and it was only sort of the moral suasion of the Canadian electorate that kept you from doing it, which, as we've discussed, is kind of disappearing a little bit. The only false statements that Elections Canada really cares about is these things. Section 91 of the Elections Act says, you can't talk about a candidate or a leader of a party or a public figure associated with a party, say that they committed an act or offense under the Act of Parliament or regulation. So you can't say that, or you can't lie about their citizenship, which is kind of interesting with Scheer because he sort of lied about it. Well, he didn't lie. He lied by omission about his own citizenship. So I don't know if you can charge him with a false statement about his American citizenship because he was lying about himself. But you can't make a false statement about their citizenship, place of birth, education, professional qualifications, or membership in a group or association. So those are the only lies that Elections Canada polices. So unless you're one of those, so it's not about policy, it's not about this. If you lie about a person, certain things about a person, you'll say they're a member of the KKK. It's like, okay, that's something that Elections Canada would be interested in. But if you say, this person is, soft on, loves terrorists, that's not something that Elections Canada cares about because that's politics. once again, we see conservatives who I'm sure have this posted on every wall down at campaign headquarters in their social media department saying, okay, here are the things we can't say. Here's all the stuff we can say. And they just take it right to the extreme.
Well, the thing that really gets me is the methods that they use to counter when they get caught all the time. Now, you brought up the Manning Center, and of course, it's been in the paper for the last little while. First, it was the Canadian Press. Christian Pass-Lang had an article, and then in the Globe and Mail, James Keller and Kelly Kreiderman followed up on it. Yes, third parties must register and list their donors, but how the donors come up with their money? No, nobody can find that out. And yet when the Manning Center is asked if they will reveal their sources, they completely sidestep that issue and they say, it's all them big bad unions. And
that's right. It's Uniform. Uniform is spending so much money, we got to counter those guys. So it's fire with fire. But so don't ask me about my donor.
but the thing is, with an organization like Unifor, you can find out, it's public information, how many members they have, where their members are, and you can find out what piece of the dues that Unifor collects from hundreds of thousands of members, you can find out how much of that money goes into their political activity. Yep. So, I mean...
And there are limits on what they're able to do.
And that's something that can be traced. But to just put the big bad unions title on that somehow to them justifies, well, there's 3 or 4 people in Alberta and Texas that really want to change in government. So, 350,000 Unifor members, a portion of their dues were taken to maybe assemble, say, $500,000. Well, we've got 4 guys who gave us $300,000, and we can't tell you who they are. This is not apples and oranges.
No, and that was what happened with the Ontario Proud Group.
Yes.
In the last Ontario provincial election, they billed themselves as a grassroots group. I mean, it was created by
Jeff
Ballingall, former political staffer. And they were very secretive and say, oh no, we get little donations from all kinds of people and all the rest. Well, then it turned out, once they finally had to report, and the problem is, they report after the election, so you don't know at the time, that it all came from developers, most of whom wanted to get their hands on the Greenbelt, on the Oak Ridges Moraine for development. So it came from Mattamy Homes and all those kinds of people in big bucks. I mean, it was a handful of donors, like you said, putting in big bucks. And the idea was, well, they want something from the government, which is access to development lands that have been off limits otherwise. So, but they astroturfed it beautifully because everyone went, oh, it's just another one of these right-wing grassroots group of ordinary concerned people who are putting in their $5 and $10. It's like, no, these people are putting in hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to affect the outcome of the election. And influence, presumably, the way the government looks at them after they win.
Well, I mean, I think that is just the same old. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I mean, this is something again that I think over time Canadians have become more blasé about. They simply accept more now than they did even 20 years ago that big money expects a reward for their donations, and they get it. And people seem to be more willing to accept that is the way things are done. And it doesn't sound like much. I mean, if you go out on the street and you say, corporations pay for special access, everybody goes, yeah, they do. But that's all anybody says. I find that to be an erosion of principles and values that has spread from the United States without a doubt. But, like people say, why do they operate like this? Well, it's working, isn't it?
Because it works, exactly.
And I don't know what you do to change that, especially as they continue to make it profitable for more and more sectors. I mean, as you said, journalism, print media especially, has worked themselves into a corner over the last 15, 20 years. They're getting to the point where they'll take money from whoever will give it to them. So if those are the people with the money, do you expect them to say no? Do you expect all these reporters who need gainful employment to just say, I'm not saying that. That's unethical. It's just not going to happen. It's not human nature. When people are put in desperate situations, their limit,
they act desperately.
yeah, exactly. Their limits will change, and it's been engineered, but here it is. I don't know what to really say, especially when there is no principled fight back from it anymore. I mean, we said this a little while ago. You mentioned it. It was always the conservatives who would lead the way into the mud. They would be the first ones in there. Hey, let's do this. Let's sling this bullshit. This will work for us. And the rest of the party used to be, oh my God, these guys just have no couth, no limits whatsoever. But in election for 43, this election, every party is doing it now. And that's the first time I've ever seen that in Canada. How about you?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I've individually, I've worked in ridings where I saw dirty campaigns. It was always, but it was always very grassroots. It was kind of, some of it was Mickey Mouse. Whether it's people who take down your signs at night, or every once in a while you'll see sort of an anonymous flyer and that's distributed in a neighborhood that condemns you for something and says something, condemns the candidate. I mean, so there have been little incidents of these sorts of things going on, but this is sort of now at a national, systemic, organized, unabashed, out in the open way of doing it. And politics, I mean, everyone says, politics is a game, but it's a serious game, and there's a lot at stake, and there used to be rules. And there are little nods and tweaks here every once in a while where someone got away with something a little cheeky, but there was a certain amount of honor among politicians. I mean, goes back to when there was a certain amount of camaraderie across the aisle as well, that there was a sense that politics was a higher calling, a duty, to your country and to your constituents, and that you behaved a certain way. And there's always exceptions to it. Politics attracts all kinds of people, like all walks of life, and you get some great ones and you get some terrible ones. Some really nice human beings, some terrible human beings. But there was at least this fiction that everyone tried to live by, which is that it was a noble calling and certain things are off limits. And there's stories. I mean, there's stories. I hear stories about politicians. I remember hearing stories when I worked in Ottawa about certain individuals and the way they behaved, whether it was booze or drugs or girls or guys or the whole range of human nature. But no one talked about it. Like everyone knew, don't sit next to that guy because he's a grabber, or don't go out for another drink with this person, and the stories were always there, but nobody weaponized them. I'm sure there's a school of thought that says, well, that kind of bad behavior ought to be outed. It's like, well, yeah, but it should be outed for its own moral turpitude, not for political gain. You don't save it and then use it as a weapon at the time, at the right time. 2 days before the election, you bring it out. If it's a moral issue, it's a moral issue, and you deal with it. If it's just one more arrow in your quiver to use to wound somebody, then the rules have changed, because there was a certain amount of, this is off limits. People's families are off limits. People's children are off limits. It's now nothing is off limits, and God help anybody, because nobody's got. There are things. You look back. Have I worn questionable Halloween costumes? I went to a lot of Halloween parties. Probably. Have people said intemperate things? Absolutely. Have you said things on Twitter or Facebook that maybe you kind of regret? Sure. There's no forgiveness for that kind of stuff anymore, and it's all out there. I mean, we have very documented lives, so people are able to pull stuff up on you all the time. But the weaponizing of that information now is something that, either you have to get a really thick skin, because no one will go into politics because everyone's got a history. Everyone's got a boyfriend or girlfriend, an ex-husband, an ex-wife, an unhappy business partner, somebody you cut off at an intersection, someone who's just not happy with you, and it'll come out and it'll be this big story if someone wants to use it. As voters, you have to be informed. You have to look at the footnotes, do your research, look beyond the headlines, read alternate viewpoint, and have a little bit of compassion for people too. I mean, I think Trudeau, with his blackface thing, or genie face, whatever you want to call it, a lot of people, I think, do actually have compassion for it, because it's like, yeah, that was incredibly stupid and very insensitive, in that time, and there's a context and all the rest, but at the same time, it's just like, that's just terrible. But a lot of people go like, he apologized. He recognized it was wrong. He certainly lived a good life since then. And, he's done more for the LGBTQ community and the minorities and all the rest. It's, that you can't doubt that. So a lot of Canadians say, yeah, I'm prepared to move on. It's not that big a deal. But when if you just bully your way through and say, yeah, those pictures are faked, or that's, whatever deflection, whatever lie, whatever, with no apology, I think that's what people need to have low tolerance for. Not necessarily for the mistakes, but for the unwillingness to recognize and remedy your mistakes. That's, if you're going to have intolerance, that's where it should be. And I think the Canadian electorate still has some of that. We used to have a lot of it. We have less of it now, just because you're being confronted and bombarded all the time with the real and imagined failings of human beings who've lived these imperfect lives. And the people who will weaponize them, will turn them into memes, will retweet them, will hand them over to a Russian or a Chinese bot farm to be able to amplify. It's a much meaner landscape that we have in politics than we've had in the last little while. And I don't know if you can come back for it. I don't know if the United States, you hope that eventually adults take over and you go back to sort of the norms and conventions. But I don't see the Conservatives interested in that. I mean, they're interested in politics as a game to be won at all costs, at all and any costs. Whereas the NDP and the Liberals, they still have a hand tied behind their backs because they think some things are off limits. They think some things are unfair. They're going to take a high road on policy, on personalities, and, are reluctant to get down in the mud. They can get down the mud, and every once in a while you'll see a good shot across the bow. That isn't their default, and it seems to be the Conservative default right now, because they think that's the way that they're going to cobble together enough votes in order to run the country again.
Well, I agree with that, but the other thing I wanted to bring up at this point was what you were just speaking about is basically the outlook of a political organization. We're talking about the ethos of a party, not necessarily as a government, but what we've been seeing in the last while. We look at the Ford government and their gas pump stickers. We look at Jason Kenney and his war room. The thing that I'm seeing that has morphed, and I will say fairly, the Notley NDP government as well, spending millions of dollars all across the world, pumping out lies about Trans Mountain expansion. This is the difference I've seen in the last 5 or 10 years. The political party mindset is being taken into the power of the state, and the power of the state is being used to impose the political party's point of view on the population. This is something I'm not used to. I mean, Harper tried it. Harper did it a lot.
Oh, yeah. Well, his action plan,
yes,
spending almost $100 million. Was it 100? No, I'm sorry. It was almost $1 billion. It was like $978 million on advertising. And it was advertising for the sole purpose of getting reelected. And and I appreciate what you just said about, the difference between party politics and government politics. Government, you think they're there to govern. They're there to make decisions. Sometimes they're ideologically based because, they've got a party platform, they've got views, and, and they do things like that, and they have to sell it a little bit, but they're the government. And while some people say the first job of government is to get reelected, it's taxpayers' money, and it's supposed to be spent on programs. It's not supposed to be spent on propaganda, on private video channels, on fundraising types of things. That line has really blurred, and it blurred tremendously, I think, for the first time under the Harper government. Because once they got in and grabbed the apparatus of the state, said, how do we make this work for us? Us not being the government or parliament, us being the Conservative Party, so that we cement our dynasty. And that was, the communications and controlling access to information and all the things that a government would do in a totalitarian state in order to push down dissent, defunding, they defunded so many challenge groups, so many interest groups, muzzling the scientists, anyone who kind of stepped out to keep themselves in power and keep them looking as good as possible while trumpeting out, the massive accomplishments of the government, real and imagined. And that was, every government has done a little bit of that. Advertising programs and, before election periods, we now have, it looks a little fishy when you start seeing a lot of Government of Ontario ads or federal ads just before the writ drops because they want to let you know what a good job their government, i.e. the party in power, is doing. We always had a little bit of that. But again, the Conservatives, like Spinal Tap, they turn it up to 11. And they use it to, in a naked attempt to stay in power. And that has changed, has changed the political landscape.
I agree, it has. And the other factor, of course, none of this can be implemented and it can't evolve without cooperation from what is supposedly the big pillar to protect people from an overbearing government, and that's the media. But I guess, again, when concentration of ownership brings us to, there was a picture in the slideshow from the show I did last week about Postmedia, and it was hundreds of daily papers, many times 2 or 3 in the same urban area, one ownership, one board, one decision.
One message.
And for a country as spread out and as underpopulated and as vastly different as Canada, that's a very dangerous thing, is it not?
Yep, absolutely. And, especially when, it's one thing to have 2 competing media outlets that are, that have different views. When vast majority of your media outlets have one view, and you have a couple of sort of lonely voices. The Toronto Star, I think, is still the biggest newspaper in Canada. And it, I always wonder just before Election Day whether or not they're going to endorse the Liberals or the NDP. They're always, if you ask a Conservative, it's the Trudeau Daily Star or the Red Star. I grew up with that because that was they put groceries on my table through my dad's work. But there's actually an incredible amount of freedom and latitude within the Star from an ideological standpoint. You obviously play to your audience. So if you're constantly out of tune with them, they're going to tune you out and stop buying your paper. But I never really sort of saw the hard red big L liberal strain at the Star. But if you ask Conservatives, it's absolutely like that. And they say more often than not, they would either grudgingly support the Liberals or say, well, the NDP really, has got some great ideas this time and endorse the NDP. But aside from the Star and a couple of others, one in Montreal, they're pretty much all in the bag for Conservatives right now. So there isn't a balance of voices, and that's what you need. You need a balance of voices. And even the CBC these days, I don't know if it is the lingering effects of Harper having stacked the board of directors of the CBC during his time and actually extending their terms out past his own election date, and sort of the trickle down effect through cuts and promotions and all the rest. But their voice isn't as moderate as it used to be. They and I don't know what the reason is for that. But you used to have sort of the national broadcaster, which was at least impartial. Now isn't looking as impartial as it has. So there isn't even that counterpoint anymore, at least in sort of the news, whether it's the power panels and all that kind of stuff. It seems to be a little skewed still. Media being on one side or the other is fine. I mean, George Brown founded the Globe and Mail as a liberal paper to combat the Tory cronyism of the Family Compact. But there was a Tory paper, there's a liberal paper, but now it's all conservative papers and a couple of lonely liberal voices out there.
Well, I mean, I remember when Post Media bought the Sun, and I mean, just here in Edmonton, the Edmonton Sun started in the late 70s, and they were a Sun paper from day one.
Yep.
Everybody knew where they sat.
Yep.
And when that was announced, and people were like, wait a minute, you're telling me that the Journal and the Sun are going to be in the same building?
Yeah.
That's like oil and water. That just does not make sense whatsoever. And we've seen that the Edmonton Journal has kept an actual journalistic core on most things. They are the only paper in Alberta to be journalistic concerning the Alberta legislature, where the Edmonton Sun and the Calgary Sun and the Calgary Herald, it's pretty obvious what their purpose is, but yet they are only allowed to go so far. They've had changes in the editorial positions when people didn't toe the line for what Post Media in Toronto said. So, I mean, this is becoming something that's obvious, but yet never talked about. And I guess it brings us to the final issue on this show, the big question: do lies work?
Well, and clearly they do. I mean, if you look at the amount of effort, money, manpower that is poured into social media programs, into these outlets, from the granddaddy of rebel media down to the newcomers like the Buffalo Chronicle. Somebody's funding these things. Somebody's making money on them, and you wouldn't be doing this work if it didn't work. And it's getting harder and harder, like I say, through the fog of too much information, of people who are on Facebook all day long. I think, I don't know if the graphic is up in rotation, but there was one about social media sites as pathways to news, or it was on the United States, and I like to think Canadians are maybe a little different, but using their numbers that 52% of Americans say that they get their news from Facebook.
Not good.
No, not good. I mean, Twitter, it's only about 17%. And frankly, I use Twitter a lot as my news aggregator, but it's because I've carefully curated a list of publications, domestic and international, that and journalists who I want to see. And, I read it all with a very critical eye. But, about 17% of people say that they get their news primarily from Twitter. 14% from Instagram. I'm not much of an Instagrammer myself. I think I've got an account, but I don't feed it at all. But so these are the channels now that people are getting their news from. And it's so subject to manipulation, whether it's, China trying to manipulate Canadian news because they're mad about Huawei, Russia because they're mad about Ukraine, or the United States Republicans who are mad about everything, or, the pan-national conservative movement that we were talking about. I'm trying to think who it was. It might have been P.T. Barnum, who said that, the biggest scam is the denial that there is a scam. People refuse to believe that they're being hoodwinked, that they think they're getting news, that they think it's reliable, they think that they're smart because they've read something somewhere, that it, that the publication that they're reading has a convincing name to it, like the Post Millennial or the Buffalo Chronicle, or how many people are reposting fake stuff from the Beaverton or the Onion, or things that are just clearly, they list. It's outrageous and it's clearly listed as fake stuff, and people still fall for it. So you got to figure they're falling for the next level down, which is the rebel post-millennial. And then when you get into mainstream media, and they're gaming it a little bit because they need the clicks, they need the eyeballs, they're competing against everybody else. What chance does the average person have to be able to figure out and take the time to figure out what's real and what isn't, and what should be shaping their opinion and what is not? And then the follow-on stories too, because a story breaks and 3 days later another story comes out and it's debunked, and it's always front page news is the big scoop. the correction is always on page 14 next to the crossword. People see the lie. They don't see the correction. I think that's one of the things that a lot of the manipulators of media, conservatives are great at this, is get the lie out there. And if you have to apologize, retract, amend, do it quietly when no one's paying attention, they've moved on to the next lie. So it clearly does work. It shapes opinion. The solution is to be better consumers, but good luck that happening, because that requires all kinds of skills. That requires a breadth of knowledge, critical thinking, the time to be able to follow stuff around and and know what's newsworthy, what is reliable, what isn't, and then keep on a story. And nobody has the time or patience for that anymore. So the lies fly around there, and the corrections, you hardly ever see them. And it shapes voting patterns. It clearly does. Otherwise, people wouldn't be doing this.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think the biggest factor is to keep the rotation at as high a speed as possible, because it's just a matter of bombardment with issues. And do you also think that the consumers for this product, which is being sold as news these days, haven't they been conditioned to this type of environment? You mentioned people that find sources and they say, yeah, I like this outlet. I like what they're saying. But it's because it reaffirms what they choose to believe. This is based on feels, not facts.
Yeah, well, confirmation bias is is very strong in all of us, and it's even in the most aware people, you have to kind of go, okay, was that? Sometimes you see stuff, you go, oh wow, that really, that statistic, that whatever, and you go, I better check it. And it's not everyone who has the courage to go and check things that challenge their views, because it's uncomfortable, and we all like to think we've got as they say in Men in Black, that we have a pretty good bead on things. And it's sometimes disheartening to realize, no, that article, which I hoped wasn't true, it is true. Or that article I hoped was true is just made up. And that takes a certain amount of maturity and intellectual rigor to be able to admit you're wrong. And there are times when I've tweeted stuff out on Twitter and I go like, oh wow, that's wrong. And I will, okay, now do I delete it? And then people go like, oh, coward, he deleted it. I say, well, I don't want to leave it out there. So do I put retweet it with a correction so people see the correction? I mean, it's really, even if you're trying to be diligent about it, it's hard to do. And, social media being what it is, it's so unforgiving as well.
Yes.
Because the second that you admit a mistake, and this is why no one wants to admit mistakes. I think admitting a mistake is one of the most powerful things that you can do as a human. But there's all kinds of people who see it as weakness and will jump on you and say that everything you've ever said in your entire life from the moment you were born is now in question because you tweeted something too quickly and didn't read the whole story. It's a rough world, and it's a medium that does not easily lend itself to forgiveness and self-correction, because there's no reward for admitting that you were wrong.
Well, I mean, there's something else getting to the end of our list here for this show. And I would also emphasize that I think this is one of the biggest issues with the Alberta election. The Notley campaign basically waited until the last 3 or 4 days. Well, it's like somebody all of a sudden said, hey, wait a minute. Why don't we talk about all the ways we've improved Alberta? Why don't we quit talking about fear Kenney and talk about what we actually did that was good for everybody? And I think this is something that you can apply to the Liberals as well, because, like you said here, in 2015, because they were up against Emperor Stoneface, Lego Hair, they came out with the humanistic campaign. Justin Trudeau was a person who had feelings and emotions, and he wasn't afraid to display them. And it worked to great effect. But 4 years later, have they gone too far that way and they've forgotten how to just say, look at the numbers, look at what we've done, look at where we are compared to the rest of the world? What the hell do you people expect the government to accomplish in 4 years? they've completely stayed away from that. And they're still trying to use the old formula, but it's so much harder to sell this time.
Yeah, well, and it's a different election as well, because, he's, even though Scheer is sort of, Harper with dimples, it's not sort of, people have forgotten already, 4 short years, just sort of how oppressive it was for certain groups under Harper. And so Trudeau did feel like a breath of fresh air, a real person. He was genuine. He made mistakes. He was, he was young. He was, personable and all these sorts of things. And he had all this family history as well, for better or worse. And, he wasn't afraid to hug people. I mean, there's that famous picture of Harper shaking his son's hand on his first day of school, which, for a lot of people, fairly or unfairly, just like, well, yeah, that's him. He's just a goldfish. And Trudeau was a breath of fresh air. And he was in third spot going into the 2015 election. No one expected him to win. Then, everyone then said, well, maybe a minority. And then he got a majority. It was a surprise to all kinds of people. But they have and you can look it up, and there's lists out there, but they're lists. I think this is significant. Lists that have been put together by ordinary people on Twitter, on Facebook, of Liberal accomplishments. The last 4 years. What has the Trudeau government accomplished in the last 4 years? And it's an impressive list. There was certainly a lot of stuff to fix after Harper just sort of neglected all kinds of things. So there are lots of things reinstated. There are lots of things improved. There are things that were clearly not on Harper's agenda, social justice things, looking after, the disadvantaged or marginalized groups. So there's an impressive list, but these aren't things that came out of the Liberal Party, particularly in its campaign. They came out by individuals who were saying, well, look at their accomplishments. The Liberal campaign itself, maybe we need to do another show to do the Monday morning quarterbacking after the election. But like you said, they've run again on feels, on hugs, on and a little bit of nagging about the environment and about our record with First Nations, Indigenous people, or on women, or on immigrants and refugees. And I think that was a tactical mistake. I think, when you're the government, you run on your record. When you're running to be the government, you run on how I'm different from the other guy. And Trudeau is still running on how I'm different from the other guys, with the hugs and the feels and all the rest. And I don't think that's what people look for in a prime minister. They may look for that in a prime ministerial candidate, but a prime minister, it's like, what did you do? And if Trudeau had a sorry record, there's certain things people are divided on or unhappy about. I mean, the pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or certain other things that could have been done better. But on the whole, it's a pretty good record, both domestically and economically, and internationally. And they chose not to run on that for whatever reason. And I think that was a tactical mistake. And I think they're far less vulnerable on their record than they would be on the feels stuff, because Conservatives are uncomfortable with feels, and it allows you to ignore the real accomplishments of the last 4 years. We'll see on Election Day whether or not the message goes out or not. But, if it had been me, if anyone had asked me, not that anyone ever does, I would have said, run on your record and, stop the glad handing and look a little more prime ministerial, because you got a record to be proud of. There's lots of time for hugs after the election.
Well, I think the root cause of that, and probably nobody in a not right-wing campaign room would admit it, is that the right-wing parties have been dictating the agenda for campaigns for quite a while now in Canada, whether they are government trying to get back in or whether they are opposition. They are the ones that are dictating the agenda in a campaign. And
the Liberals have been constantly on the defensive in this campaign, which means they're always reacting. I mean, and they're reacting, sometimes you get a bombshell like the blackface genie pictures. And you've got to react to that because that comes out of left field. But you call the election. When the election is, you're the governing party, you should have all your candidates ready, you should have all your money, you should have tested all your messages, you should be ready to hit the ground running, and it should be your agenda and you stick to it. You've got a message, you get it out. This campaign, I think the Liberals have been, like you say, the campaign has been dictated by the Conservatives. They've been dancing to their tune, and you're automatically on the defensive constantly. It makes you look weak, and you never catch up, because every time you recover from one blow, and especially if they're giving you low blows and lies, you recover from one thing, the next one comes. It's not a recipe for a strong showing in an election.
And again, it's when the corporate media, when the mass media is the one tagging along with the conservative agenda for the momentum of the campaign, that only makes it that much harder, right?
Yep, you're fighting your way, up from the bottom when you should be on top of it. I just want to say, everyone, go out and vote. I don't, it doesn't matter who you vote for. Make sure you go out and vote. It's an important election. All elections are important, but it's important to get out there and no candidate's perfect, and but there are lots of good candidates out there, and I think there's lots of important things at stake this election. So make sure you go out and exercise your franchise.
Well, I don't think that the system is perfect by any means. Everybody has to come to grips with that and accept that reality. I've said this about a lot of things. The reason that things don't work that great a lot of the time is because it involves people. We are flawed, face it. And if you think you're going to find a superior being or superior level of execution and thought just because these people are politicians, I think there's more than enough evidence to prove that you're definitely barking up the wrong tree on that sort of thing. But once again, Stephen, I would like to thank you for being on the show.
Glenn, thanks for inviting me back on. It's always such a pleasure chatting with you.
Well, I'd just like to tell listeners that, shows with Stephen are like the least stressed shows that I ever do, because once Stephen says, sure, I'll come on, it's like, okay, we've got a show. There's really nothing that has to be planned past that. I know that you will be prepared and bring stuff that you want the listeners to hear. And I managed to play along and fill in my part of it. And I still, every time we do this, I laugh about the second show we did, where we both got a good chuckle, that when we did our first show, we had more live listeners than Ezra had live viewers on Sun TV.
It's true.
Because we went head to head with them.
Well, that's all you. I appreciate the opportunity coming on. And like I say, that was number 8. So I look forward to number 9.
Well, you never know. You brought it up. There may be a post-election show in the works. I'm in favor of that. We'll see what happens. And it gives the listeners something to look forward to. But yes, I agree with you. October 21st is the day. People die all over the world for this right to put their X. Exercise your right. And if you want to be pessimistic about it, you get one chance every 4 years. This is it. Take it. Wouldn't you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. Do your homework.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thanks, Glenn.
And there you have it. Thank you very much, Stephen. As you heard, there was alluding to a post-election review show. We'll see what happens. You never know. Promises don't always come true, but we'll see what we can do. Remember, everybody, get out there and vote. Thanks for listening to The View Up Here. That's it for tonight. Good night.